It's time for Bravo with Sheila, a place to be enlightened, a place to be built up, and always a place to remember that when nothing changes, nothing changes. Welcome, welcome, welcome. Hello, everyone. How is everyone doing? Thank you for being here, right here with me tonight. I really appreciate that you are here at the Bravo with Sheila Network. We're doing something special and something different for the month of April. Might lean into May, not sure, but I really been wanting to do this for a minute now, so I decided to do it now. So get your cool beverage and put your feet up and just take a stroll into the journey of Harlem. Harlem, New York City. Why Harlem, you ask? Because I was born and raised in Harlem. I became the woman I am with the jewels of life growing up in Harlem. I know both sides of the coins of life, for lack of a better term. But I wanted to share with some of you, and some of you may have already known or been to Harlem, but let's take a journey. Let's take a walk. So we're going to start tonight with our first sitting down and watching and learning and getting into the great place of Harlem, New York City. I give a special thanks to the Velocity Philosophy uh, Network or channel. And they graciously are showing this information, and it's a no copyright infringement. So I decided to go ahead and grab it up and thank them publicly for allowing us to learn and see the beauty and the ups and downs and turnarounds of Harlem, New York City. So I want you to sit back, like I said, get a cool beverage. I want you to give yourself a bravo. If you need to encourage yourself, go ahead and give yourself a bravo, and you do not need permission. I said you do not need permission, and just give yourself a bravo. So we're going to get into it. I might drop down and allow you just to enjoy, and I will be back when this is over. It's not necessarily a reaction video. This is something I want you to sit and watch and learn about the Harlem Renaissance. And that's what we're coming out the gate with, the Harlem Renaissance. So here we go, you wonderful people. But before we do that, let me just do one thing, because I know it's necessary for me to ask you to do what is necessary for our channel to grow and for us to be able to push this content a little further out into the streets, the YouTube streets, so that others can get it and the channel can grow. We are pressing our way to 1,000 subs. So I hope that you like, subscribe, and share. Amen. All right. So this is what I want you to do. All right, that was simple enough, right? Okay, let's get into what we're doing tonight on this Tuesday evening on the Bravo with Sheila Network. Let's get into it. I'm excited. I'm excited to share. And here we go.
the Harlem Renaissance is an important event. To proclaim its story, one must foremost begin with the Great Migration. After the Civil War, African Americans started exiting the South in diminutive numbers. The escalation in the pace of African Americans departing from the South marks the beginning of the Great Migration. The Great Migration transpired from 1910 to 1970 and incorporated two spans. The first Great Migration ensued from 1910 to 1930, and the second Great Migration from 1940 to 1970. It was the first Great Migration that ushered in the Harlem Renaissance. Historians attributed the transition in population to push pull factors. Elements that compelled black folks to desert the South were Jim Crow laws, terrorist attacks by white supremacists, and the boll weevil. Factors that lured African Americans to the North were labor opportunities of the First World War and the termination of immigration into the United States. African Americans relocated to the prominent municipalities of the Northeast and the Midwest. In 1910, New York's African American inhabitants expanded from 140,000 to 650,000 by 1940. Initially, Harlem was a white community in uptown Manhattan. African Americans began to arrive inhabiting low rent apartments and affordable rooms. Over time, the transformation became pronounced in the community. This conversion in the population caught the attention of Philip Payton Jr., an aspiring African American entrepreneur. Payton Jr. worked for his family barbering business while his two brothers attended Yale University. He wanted to attend the university like his brothers, but he couldn't afford to. Payton endeavored several jobs before landing a janitorial position at a real estate firm. His job at the firm opened the door for property management prospects. His first newspaper advertisement read, quote, "Colored man makes special furnishing colored tenants." African Americans in the area encountered resistance. In 1905, the New York Herald ran the headline announcing, quote, "Negroes move into Harlem," end quote. The story read, "An untoward circumstance has been injected into the private dwelling market in the vicinity of 133rd and 134th Streets. During the last 3 years, flats that were occupied entirely by white folks have been captured for occupation by a Negro population. 133rd still shows some signs of resistance to the blending of colors in the streets, but between Lenox and 7th Avenues has practically succumbed to the ingress of colored tenants. Real estate brokers predict that it's only a matter of time before the entire block will be a stronghold for the Negro population." Payton Jr. recognized this trend and acted upon it. On June 15, 1904, he chartered the African American Realty Company. The first offering for investors was $50,000 at $10 each. The investment proposition enticed small black investors interested in making yields and assembling a base for African American empowerment. He advertised directly to black investors, telling them, quote, "Now is the time to buy. If you want to be numbered among those of the race who are doing something towards solving the so-called race problem." In 1905, the white-owned Hudson Realty Company bought land on West 135th Street near Lenox Avenue. The land Hudson purchased was in the heart of Harlem, and plans were to build residential housing. Hudson also purchased 3 adjacent tenement buildings from Afro American Realty. After the acquisition, Hudson evicted all the black inhabitants and substituted them with whites. The Afro American Realty Company responded by attaining 2 neighboring apartment houses, evicting their white renters, and replacing them with blacks expelled by Hudson. These dysfunctional incidents triggered a decline in property value, and ultimately, Hudson Company sold its initial acquisitions back to Afro American Realty at a considerable loss. This shrewd business maneuvering against Hudson enhanced Peyton Jr.'s prestige and seduced more investors in Afro American Realty Company. The Afro American Realty Company continued to obtain houses, tenements, and apartment buildings in and around Harlem. African Americans from neighboring areas began to migrate to Harlem, and before the 1910 Great Migration, Harlem was clearly majority black. Migration into New York did not just come from African Americans in the South. Blacks migrated from Jamaica, Haiti, Puerto Rico, and the Dominican. The most well known Caribbean immigrant from this period was Marcus Garvey. Garvey infused a sense of militant black nationalism into academic and creative cultural developments. In Emancipated from Mental Slavery, Select Sayings of Marcus Garvey, he says, quote, "Look for me in the whirlwind or the storm. Look for me all around you, for, with God's grace, I shall come and bring with me countless millions of black slaves who have died in America and the West Indies and the millions in Africa to aid you in the fight for liberty, freedom, and life." End quote. The merger of black political ideas, literary, and artistic expression fused and became what we now call the Harlem Renaissance. The struggle from slavery to emancipation began with the 13th Amendment, adopted on December 18, 1865, abolishing slavery and enforced servitude. On July 9, 1868, ratified the 14th Amendment guaranteed citizenship protection under the law. These two amendments were to be strengthened bills known as the Enforcement Acts. The Enforcement Acts specifically safeguarded African Americans' right to vote, hold office, serve on juries, and be guaranteed equal protection under the law. In addition, the Enforcement Acts permitted the federal government to intercede when states did not defend these rights. The purpose of the Enforcement Acts was to improve the conditions for African Americans during Reconstruction by neutralizing the Ku Klux Klan and other terrorist organizations that arose after the emancipation of African Americans. The Enforcement Acts prohibited terrorist acts committed to intimidate African Americans from embracing freedom and admission to suffrage rights. The new federal laws and constitutional amendments became only words on paper due to a lack of will to enforce them. White supremacist redeemers took control of legislators in the South and began implementing black codes, also known as Jim Crow laws. Proponents of these laws touted them as sensible and donned the phrase separate but equal regarding the status of blacks. The black codes implemented in each state became fortified in 1883 when the Supreme Court struck down the Civil Rights Act. The Supreme Court's justification for striking down the Civil Rights Act was that it did not address civil rights, but rather social. The court cited the 14th Amendment protected a person's civil rights from violation by the state and not by the efforts of individuals. The Supreme Court's decision to strike down the Civil Rights Act set the stage for state legislators to enact lawmaking that legalized segregation in public places. The Supreme Court upheld the law in 1896 with the decision of the Plessy versus Ferguson case. The decision established the notorious Declaration of Separate but Equal, concluding that segregation did not violate the Equal Protection Clause in the 14th Amendment so long as facilities were similar. The Supreme Court established separation, but equality was not a part of the equation. Facilities made for African Americans were inferior, underfunded, and unmanaged, in effect, reestablishing institutionalized racism and discrimination. Racism in the North enjoyed taking the form of housing segregation, banking lending practices, and job discrimination. With the United States military already segregated, General Albert Burleson established plans to segregate the railway mail service. President Woodrow Wilson introduced federal workplace segregation in 1913, which echoed many procedures established in the South. William Edward Burghardt Du Bois was born in 1868 in Great Barrington, Massachusetts. His father, Alfred, deserted the family, leaving his mother to sustain the family as a domestic servant. Du Bois excelled in public school and attended the historical Black Fisk University in Nashville, Tennessee. At Fisk University, Du Bois obtained his education and first-hand experience with life in the Jim Crow South. After attending Fisk, Du Bois went to Harvard and graduated in 1895 with a doctorate in history. His PhD dissertation, The Suppression of the African Slave Trade to the United States of America, was published as a book, becoming his first in dozens he would later write. After attending Harvard, Du Bois studied sociology at the University of Berlin for the next few years. He believed each race possessed its unique gift and should contribute its gift to a global, individual, and collective kingdom of culture. When Du Bois returned to the United States, he quickly realized options for pursuing a career in academia were limited. Du Bois eventually found an opportunity at Atlanta University, where he finished his literary classic, The Souls of Black Folks. The Souls of Black Folks was a collection of essays, snippets of autobiography, and fiction intended to shine a light on the reality of those who lived, quote, within the veil, end quote. The intended audience was supposed to be white, but Du Bois' book had a more significant influence on Blacks. This influence became especially felt by the artists, poets, and writers who created the backbone of the Harlem Renaissance. Du Bois knew exactly where he stood in the emerging Black movement. His position in the African American struggle was clear when contrasted against the views of Booker T. Washington. In the beginning, Du Bois' disagreements with Washington's work and sentiments were respectful, but eventually, he increasingly became harsh towards him. Booker Taliaferro Washington was born an enslaved person on April 5th, 1856, in Halesford, Virginia. Washington entered the domain of education and founded the Tuskegee Institute. Washington established the Tuskegee Institute with the vision of what a population emerging from generations of slavery required to integrate into society. His position on the African American struggle was for incremental entry, emphasizing educational development and political representation. He urged Blacks to accept discrimination briefly, concentrate on personal growth, and prove their work through hard work and material prosperity. Du Bois disagreed with this position, stating that it gave a passive acceptance of Jim Crow racism. Du Bois and other like-minded Black intellectuals started the Niagara movement in opposition to Booker T. Washington's passive strategy. The Niagara movement promoted rapid changes in opposition to racial segregation and disenfranchisement. The Niagara movement did not gain much support, but its creation indicates a desire of some African Americans to take a stronger stance against codified white supremacy. In 1910, Du Bois moved to New York, where he began working for the NAACP and edited its monthly journal, The Crisis. Du Bois could not accomplish much with the predominantly white leadership of the NAACP, but he became famous through the mainly Black readership of The Crisis. His views on lynching, World War I, Bolshevism, Pan-Africanism, Garveyism, and the New Deal became talking points. Du Bois positioned himself as the torchbearer of the new literary and artistic movement during the Harlem Renaissance. He recognized that artistic and literary expression would prove Black legitimacy far better than Blacks accepting discrimination and pursuing an education. Du Bois argued that the Black man was the original American artist, and the rude melodies of Black slaves were the only authentic American music. Du Bois stated that Black laughter, dance, and music gave substance to an otherwise empty, materialistic American culture. Through the crisis, Du Bois launched a competition for Black writers. It was through this competition that Langston Hughes popularized his poem, The Negro Speaks Rivers. Du Bois was ultimately guilty of intellectual and artistic snobbery. He could not embrace Louis Armstrong or Billie Holiday over Wagner and Beethoven. He couldn't embrace Langston Hughes and Claude McKay over Byron and Tennyson. The inability to embrace African Americans over whites contradicted the very movement he was instrumental in creating. Du Bois' appeal to classical music and his declarations for blacks to compete and not simply mimic estranged him from the movement where he existed on its fringes. Booker T. Washington lectured patience and incremental growth, and Du Bois pushed the status quo, demanding full equality. But Marcus Garvey personified Black vigor and political assertiveness. Marcus Garvey is the founder of Black Pride and modern Black nationalism. African Americans needed a charismatic leader who could uplift them and provide assertive direction, and Garvey provided just that. Marcus Garvey was born August the 17th, 1887, in St. Ann's Bay, Jamaica. He was a printer by trade and the publisher of several small newspapers. Garvey was a gifted public speaker who gained a political education on the sugar plantations of Jamaica. In 1910, he left Jamaica and traveled through Central and South America. Garvey's beliefs developed with the influence of Du Bois' ideas of Pan-Africanism and Booker T. Washington's pragmatic views. He synthesized their ideas with the vision of where to go and expectations for African Americans to aspire beyond plantations and colonial power. In 1912, he traveled to Europe and took classes in law and philosophy at the University of London. Garvey also contributed to the African Times and Oriental Review, published by Duce Muhammad Ali. Duce Muhammad Ali was an Egyptian Sudanese intellectual known for his radical positions on African nationalism. His influence was significant among a generation of politically conscious Black diasporans. Ali was very influential to Garvey, who often spoke at Hyde Park's Speaker's Corner. When Garvey returned to Jamaica, he adopted the ideology of Booker T. Washington. He preached accommodating colonial rule and taking a one-step-at-a-time approach to Black advancement. On Garvey's first visit to the United States in 1916, he quickly changed his mind about that position. The new Negro era was in full swing, and Booker T. Washington passed away just shortly ago. Traveling to Tuskegee became somewhat of a pilgrimage, and along the way, Garvey encountered racism like nothing he had ever experienced. Garvey learned that the United States was a hotbed of racial politics beyond his experiences. The experience in the United States altered his vision and style of activism. In 1917, the city of East St. Louis became the scene of a race riot. An influx of African American workers into traditional white industries provoked tensions that led to a violent anti-Black massacre supported by law enforcement. This event impacted Garvey, and as a response, he founded the Universal Negro Improvement Association. He gave a lengthy speech on July 8, 1917, at Lafayette Hall, proclaiming, quote, "The East St. Louis riot, or rather massacre, will go down in history as one of the bloodiest of outrages against mankind for which any class of people could be held guilty. This is no time for fine words, but a time to lift one's voice against the savagery of a people who claim to be the dispenser of democracy." Marcus Garvey emerged as one of the most influential black leaders of the generation. He was an electric speaker whose ideas on African American economic and cultural independence became known as Garveyism. One can describe Garveyism as the liberation of Africa from colonial rule and the spiritual rescue of the black race. Garvey viewed Africa as a fallen society removed from the earlier days of greatness. He believed the black race was the only one capable of restoring Africa to greatness and global respect. At the start of the 1920s, many young blacks arrived from Africa to the United States to obtain higher education. The influx was due to financial support from independent churches that began to spring up across the African continent. This movement became known as Ethiopianism, edified by Psalm 68:31. Ethiopia stretched forth its hands unto God. The independent churches in Africa interpreted this phrase to imply a direct contact between the black race and God for the sacred objective of emancipation. Traditional white-dominated churches, which pioneered colonialism on the African continent, were seen as impeding or even harming black progress. Independent churches utilized the fundamental parts of Christianity but injected it with black standards while using it to organize politically. The earliest transatlantic ecumenical partnership and the first independent black church in the United States was the African Methodist Episcopal Church. Garvey did not work from within the church, but his campaign was about black redemption. Garvey's vision for black redemption, alongside Du Bois' Pan-Africanism, synthesized and exploded across the consciousness of the black diaspora. The machine of Garveyism was the Universal Negro Improvement Association. Its headquarters in Harlem enclosed a 6-block radius from 135th Street and Lenox Avenue. The area contained the movement's spiritual center, Liberty Hall, alongside UNIA-affiliated businesses. The most popular UNIA-affiliated company was the Black Star Line. It intended to spread black business and people across the globe and ultimately facilitate the return of American blacks to Africa in mass. This event became known as the Back to Africa movement. The Black Star Line operated for 3 years between 1919 and 1922. The shipping company did not become a financial success, but became a cultural one. The grassroots adored Garvey, but the black Angles saw Garvey as an embarrassment. People saw Garvey parading around in the uniform and hat of an imperial ruler. Du Bois described Garvey as, quote, "without doubt, the most dangerous enemy of the Negro race in America and in the world. He is either a lunatic or," end quote. His main objection to Garvey was his position that no black American could ever obtain citizenship, so the separation of all blacks back to Africa was the only solution to the Negro problem. Garvey accused Du Bois of bias based on his lighter skin and academic experience. Du Bois referred to Garvey as an ugly, fat black man, and Garvey called Du Bois a white man's nigger. Garvey was deported back to Jamaica in 1927. Ironically, Du Bois himself forfeited his American citizenship and moved to Ghana. The Harlem Renaissance was not only a conscious movement, but it was an artistic one as well. It established a new Black cultural uniqueness and signaled an arrival of a new age for African Americans. Du Bois saw Black achievement as equal to white achievements and once stated, quote, "It is unfair to judge us by our criminals and prostitutes." In Du Bois' mind, if Blacks could rival whites in cultural achievement, then Blacks would have a fair assertion of equality. Some African Americans embraced this philosophy and made sure their art reflected it. Artists like Aaron Douglas had a separate view of what Black art should be about. Aaron Douglas was born May 26, 1899, in Topeka, Kansas. In 1925, Douglas ended up in Harlem by chance while en route to Paris to attend the university. What he witnessed in Harlem encouraged him to stay. His first work was to illustrate Alain Locke's book, The New Negro. Shortly after, Douglas acquired additional work from writers like Langston Hughes, Charles S. Johnson, Countee Cullen, Claude McKay, Wallace Thurman, and James Weldon Johnson. His work incorporated Art Deco with modernist forms and stylized geometric patterns and shapes of African art. Douglas based himself in Harlem, but most of the notable Black artists of his time lived in Paris. In Paris, an occurrence similar to the Harlem Renaissance called the Paris Noir, or the Black Paris, was happening. Black artists found a far greater appreciation for their arts in Paris. Audiences in France understood Black art, and Black artists from the United States found Paris appealing. The seeds for appreciation of Black art in France began with the early ragtime artists. The freedom and appreciation Blacks experienced in Paris inspired the innovation of art with a greater degree of sophistication. Black artists thrived in Paris until the Great Depression forced many Blacks back to America. The return of Black artists from Paris is why the finest work in visual arts from the Harlem Renaissance materialized in the 1930s. The relocation may have been undesired by the artists that returned, but the art that they brought back to America inspired the work of local New York artists. One such artist was Palmer Hayden. Palmer C. Hayden was born on January 15, 1890, in Widewater, Virginia. He used oils and watercolors to depict African American social landscapes. He attended Cooper Union in New York and Booth Bay Art Colony in Maine. In 1925, he created his first masterwork, Fétiche et Fleurs. Another artist was Archibald Motley. Archibald John Motley Jr. was born October 7, 1891, in New Orleans, Louisiana. He became characterized as a jazz age modernist. Motley's art captured the dynamic scenes of Black life during this period. He attended the Art Institute of Chicago and was instrumental in a similar art movement occurring in Chicago. Hayden and Motley were artists who stayed true to expressing the Black experience in their work. Sergeant Claude Johnson was another impactful artist of the Harlem Renaissance. Johnson's creations echoed African forms, and he arguably was one of the best artists from the Harlem Renaissance. His work encompassed sculptures, carvings, masks, murals, and simultaneously. The finest of Augusta Savage. Savage was a traveled academic advocate whose work became influenced by both Africa and America. She produced bronze busts of prominent African American leaders. Savage received a scholarship to study in France, but had it rescinded due to jealous white students who received the same scholarship. Her stunted academic pursuits inspired her to advocate for the development of young Black artists. She is one of the longest living artists from that era and a key figure in the civil rights movement. Her well-known bust of the Harlem child, Gammon, made her famous. Another artist was Meta Vo Warwick Fuller. Fuller was a poet, sculptor, and a painter. Her work was distinctly Afrocentric with a classical European influence. One of her peers considered her the most imaginative black artist of her generation. Fuller and Savage are the first significant African American female sculptors. Fuller's work embodied the new pro black identity emerging from the Harlem Renaissance. The amount of literature produced during the Harlem Renaissance is staggering. Literature came in several forms, from poetry, drama, periodicals, journals, and news reporting. March 21st, 1924, a significant event occurred in Black literature. Organized by Charles S. Johnson, editor of Opportunity, a journal of Negro life, the event celebrated the publication of Jesse Fawcett's There Is Confusion. There Is Confusion was significant due to its new portrayals of African Americans in literature. The venue chosen for the event was the Civic Club, about 100 blocks south of Harlem. Johnson asked Alon Locke to preside over the event. Locke agreed to preside over the event as long as it expanded to include all African American writers instead of Fawcett by herself. Alon Locke was another key Harlem Renaissance artist. Born on September 13, 1885 in Philadelphia, Locke was a literary forefather. Alon Locke became the first black man to obtain a Rhodes Scholarship, and his academic career included places like Harvard and Oxford University. His most influential work was The New Negro, published in 1925. The title of his work provided the name and the vision of the revitalized black future. Alon was gay, and he was an advocate for young gay African Americans. Alon hosted the Civic Club dinner, which ended up being a spectacular gala occasion with over 100 guests from Du Bois to James Weldon Johnson. The dinner coalesced African American writers and intellectuals together, accelerating the scholarly aspect of the Harlem Renaissance. In 1921, the famous 63rd Street Music Hall hosted a musical called Shuffle Along, written by comedians Flournoy Miller and Aubrey Lyles. The score was composed and sung by Eubie Blake and Noble Sissle. The performers included Josephine Baker and Paul Robeson, who would later become superstars. The first performance of Shuffle Along was so influential, it defined the nature and essence of nightlife during the Harlem Renaissance. It introduced black music and theater to white audiences who became fascinated. It introduced jazz to Broadway, along with excitingly new, finely choreographed jazz routines. Before long, many black written shows appeared on Broadway. Eventually, white writers began to produce their versions of black musical comedies. Shuffle Along also assisted in the development of jazz and the blues. Harlem did not create jazz. It came from the blacks who moved from places like New Orleans, Memphis, and St. Louis because of the Great Migration. Author James Weldon Johnson said, "Jazz came to Harlem around 1905 with the Memphis students. They played at Proctor's 23rd Street Theater. One of the Memphis student members, James Reese Europe, became a well-known composer. Europe performed at the Clef Club Orchestra at Carnegie Hall. Jazz clubs started to manifest everywhere in Harlem. These places became legendary, like the Alhambra Ballroom, the Apollo Theater, Club Harlem, Lenox Lounge, Showman's Jazz Club, and Minton's Playhouse. Many greats like Ella Fitzgerald, Louis Armstrong, Count Basie, Billie Holiday, and Cab Calloway would perform at these venues and go on as international superstars. During the height of the French Empire, Empire in the late 20th century, Paris became the hub of Black cultural understanding and revitalization. Blacks within the French colonies attempted to solidify and secure their culture against the French, who were trying to replace it. The development of Black society in the African colonies improved rapidly due to missionary-sponsored primary education. The educated class began to take control of the developing colonial military, police, industry, and administration. These blacks became the first generation of blacks who obtained their education from universities overseas. Educated blacks transformed societies in Africa and the Caribbean. A new generation of young black leaders, knowledgeable in Western politics and society, sought to embrace the modern world while synthesizing it with their own culture. This new philosophy became referred to as negritude. Its greatest advocate was Leopold Senghor, a Senegalese scholar and poet. Senegal was France's primary territory in Africa and the origin of the assimilation movement. Assimilation was a movement to turn the black elite of the colonies into black Frenchmen. French institutions became open to direct utilization from people within the colonies. When France gained control over most of the West and equatorial African continent, assimilating 60 million Africans became unpractical. The influx of black intellectuals, artists, and aspiring leaders into Paris created a vibrant black social and academic scene. Senghor came to Paris in 1928 at the age of 22. Senghor attended Sorbonne and the University of Paris, where he received the aggregation in French grammar. He later worked as a professor at the universities of Tours and Paris, teaching from 1935 to 1945. After World War II, he became dean of the linguistics department with the École nationale de la France des Outre-mer until 1960. In 1960, Senghor led Senegal to independence. Leopold Senghor was not the sole founder of negritude. Another founder, M. Césaire, was an intellectual and a poet. Césaire was fiercely loyal to his African roots and hostile to the French colonization of his homeland. Léon Damas was another founder. Damas was a poet and an intellectual who later became politically active in his homeland of French Guiana. The three men met in Paris, and around them were other similar-minded people from the French colonial diaspora. Two integral similar-minded thinkers were the Nardal sisters, Paulette and Jean. The Nardal sisters were socialites who provided a tremendous contribution to the movement. The Nardal sisters were born into an upper-middle-class family that was able to facilitate their education in Paris. Paulette was the first black person to attend Sorbonne. Her sister Jean followed behind. Historians credit them for facilitating the movement through their salon, the Clermont Salon. Le Clermont Salon was a tea shop popular with black scholars and a meeting ground where intellectuals discussed negritude. The Nardal sisters refined the fundamental philosophies of negritude and helped establish the movement. Paulette Nardal translated many of the works of the Harlem Renaissance writers into French. The translations assisted in developing a common identity and bridging the Harlem Renaissance with the movement in Paris. In October 1931, the sisters founded La Revue du Monde Noir, Review of the Black World, a journal that became influential in conveying the Pan-African ideals of negritude. Black military men during World War I were the first to notice artistic and social freedom in Paris. Paris hosted a significant black population going back to the sale of Louisiana and the many blacks who left North America to escape the threat of slavery. It was a setting comparatively free of racism that enticed many to stay. The Americans who stayed in Paris brought jazz with them and gave birth to the Paris Noir. African American artists and writers found Paris to be invigoratingly free of racism. Montmartre became the center of a community of African American jazz clubs like Le Grand Duc and Chez Florence. The person credited for bringing the jazz revolution to Paris is Lieutenant James R. Europe. The Senegalese TIL, already in large numbers in France, made it easy to receive black troops into Paris during World War I. French accepted they owed the blacks from the colonies, and their perspective towards black existence in France was more receptive than in America. James Reese Europe was born in Mobile, Alabama in 1880. His family became a part of the Great Migration and moved to Washington, D.C. in 1890. He followed his older brother to New York and worked as a composer and a conductor, contributing to several theatrical productions. He became a founding member of the Clef Club. The Clef Club was a musician's hangout, labor exchange, and a concert venue. The Clef Club Orchestra became the first African American orchestra in America. The orchestra included 125 members playing a variety of instruments. In 1913, Europe became a musical director for the ballroom dancers Vernon and Irene Castle. Europe assisted the Castles in developing dance routines with syncopation. Europe and the Castles appeared in venues not traditionally familiar to black performers, fueling the growth of dance hall and nightlife style. Europe and his association with the Castles contributed to the breaking down of prejudices against black music. Europe's arrangement of the Memphis Blues is said to have led to the creation of the foxtrot. As the United States approached its entrance into World War I, the 15th National Guard Regiment, made of all black troops, was formed in Harlem. Europe was commissioned as a lieutenant in order to organize a regiment band. The 15th National Guard Regiment was a labor force until its reestablishment as the 369th U.S. Army Regiment. The 369th was attached to the French Army and became known as the Harlem Hellfighters or the Black Rattlers. The 369th's combat efforts earned the respect of their French peers. What gained an even greater respect was their marching band, which boosted morale and became arguably the most famous band in Europe. On February 9th, 1919, the 369th returned home to New York. The band recorded 24 instrumental and 6 vocal ensemble sides for the French record company Bate. James Europe was tragically killed in a knife attack by one of his drummers after an argument. He died at the age of 39 and became the first African American to have a public funeral in New York City. Europe's influence lived on through band members who stayed behind in France. These band members organized and began to perform in Paris. The district of Lower Montmartre became known as Black Montmartre. The sound that was becoming jazz was very popular with French audiences, but it took time for French composers to embrace it. By 1930, jazz became more mainstream, and French jazz composers and performers finally manifested. In Shuffle Along, Josephine Baker transformed a small part as a chorus girl into a starring role. Sissel provided her with special lessons and attempted to add more structure and professionalism to her performances. She complied with instructions during rehearsals, but broke into wild improvisations once in front of audiences. After Shuffle Along, Cecil Noble produced In Banville. White critics remarked that it angled too much to be high art and did not reach expectations of what whites perceived as black comedy. To further appeal to white audiences, In Banville was renamed the Chocolate Dandies. When the Chocolate Dandies ended, several cast members moved to Harlem. The review Ten Town Topics hired Baker, and she performed at the Plantation Theater restaurant. Shows at the Plantation Theater restaurant attracted white theater goers and well to do blacks. African Americans who attended the show had to sit at the corner tables. Segregation was still the law of the land, even in Harlem during the Black Renaissance. In 1925, a wealthy American woman named Carolyn Dudley offered to take Baker to Paris with a troupe of black dancers and singers. Josephine said, quote, I wanted to get far away from those who believed in cruelty. So then I went to France, a land of true freedom, democracy, equality, and fraternity. Josephine headed to France at age 19, and one of her main reasons for leaving was her hatred for racism in America. Baker realized that no matter how successful she became in America, she would still receive second class citizenship. Josephine set sail on a steamship to Paris and later wrote, when the Statue of Liberty disappeared over the horizon, I knew I was free. When the steamship docked at Le Havre, Josephine boarded a train to Paris, and people welcomed her with smiles, coffee, and croissants. From the train, Josephine boarded a bus for the Theatre des Champs-Élysées. Outside of the theater was Paul Collin, an up-and-coming artist commissioned to illustrate a poster advertising La Negra Revue. Collin had 24 hours to get the poster done, and while observing Josephine during rehearsals, he became impressed by her. Collin had an interpreter ask if she would come to his studio that night, where he convinced her to strip down while striking poses as he made numerous sketches of her. The poster featuring Josephine became famous. The director of the theater didn't like how the show was programmed, so he hired Jacques Charles. Charles wanted to feature Josephine more prominently. He also wanted to make the show closer to the idea of primal, exotic, and black eroticism. Charles created the Danse Sauvage for her to perform with Joe Alex. They both were to wear only skirts of feathers, like, quote, true African. Charles also wanted Josephine to appear topless, which was routine for dance hall performers and chorus girls. Charles's choreography was a projection of the stereotypes of African primitives, and his imagined dance was far from resembling African dance. Josephine was against appearing half naked and doing the, quote, primitive dance. Josephine's fears melted away on the show's opening night. She gave an incredible performance, and when it came time for the Danse Sauvage, she did a seductive, wildly rhythmic dance. Josephine later wrote, quote, I was driven by dark forces I didn't recognize. At the end of the dance, the crowd leaped to their feet, applauding feverishly. Critics called her the African Eros and the Black Venus. Picasso referred to her as the Nefertiti of now. In one night, Josephine Baker became a Parisian superstar. Josephine began to receive lavish gifts and jewelry from fans. She lived in a two-bedroom suite in the Hotel Fournet. Carolyn Dudley introduced Josephine to French designer Paul Perret, who transformed Josephine's wardrobe. Josephine and Paul Collin, the new designer, began to have a romantic relationship, and he introduced her to Parisian socialites. By the end of 1926, she became the most photographed woman in the world. Josephine Baker dolls sold to thousands. Unexpectedly, white women held her up as a template for beauty, and she was a symbol of liberation. Josephine moved from Montmartre to an upscale neighborhood. She was celebrated, but still encountered racism. Josephine inspired white women to tan their skin to look more like her. Ironically, Josephine often rubbed herself with lemon juice and bathed in goat's milk and bleach to become lighter. In the 1930s, she started touring for a show named Les Joies de Paris, and by 1933, she was touring worldwide. In 1935, Josephine became booked to perform on Siegfried Follies. It made her the first black woman to appear on the show, and she became the last. Sailing into New York, she remembered how she felt leaving all those years before. Her experiences in France grew her conviction tremendously, but she discovered America had not changed. She arrived in America and took a cab to the hotel where the manager checked her in and told her not to walk through the lobby again. In New York, she was still a second class citizen. Josephine also experienced harsh racist criticism of her performance on Siegfried Follies. In addition, African Americans also criticized her, seeing her as too European. Josephine arrived back in Paris before her 30th birthday in 1936. She was active in the Red Cross and the French resistance during World War II. She won two of France's highest military honors, the Croix de Guerre and the Legion of Honor. She partook alongside Martin Luther King in the March on Washington in 1963. Baker died on April 12, 1975, and received full military honors at her burial in Paris. The Harlem Renaissance was a unique time and place for African Americans. The movement helped to reinvent new ideas of blackness in art, dance, and literature. It inspired thinkers, writers, and performers that still have an impact on us to this very day. We still debate the ideas of W.E.B. Du Bois and Marcus Garvey. Artists like Haydn, Motley, Johnson still influence painters today. Dances made famous by Josephine Baker and Mabel Lee can be seen on TikTok today. Performers and songwriters like Cab Calloway still find relevance today. Writers like Langston Hughes inspired generations to become poets and embrace literature. I hope that in the near future, we can have another Black Renaissance like the one that happened in the Harlem Renaissance. I also hope that you'll subscribe to my channel and watch all my videos as well. I also wanted to give a big shout out to everybody that subscribed to my channel. Thank you so much. I'm going to switch up the content on my next one, so stay tuned. Until then, peace.
Okay, that was absolutely wonderful. Oh my goodness. I hope that you enjoyed that. Listen, remember that in the 1920s, Harlem had become the most famous African American community in the world. Yeah, and the concentration, remember, of Black men and women in Harlem produced a lively, one of those lively scenes. So I want you to just continue to stay with us as we journey through whatever I decide to do for the next few weeks here on Tuesday evenings here on the Bravo with Sheila Network. Know that the journals and ideas sparked interest in African music and images and history. So I think that this was a wonderful time to spend with you. And you know that Harlem is a must visit neighborhood located located at the northern end of Manhattan, known to be steeped in African American history and culture. So once again, I thank you so very much for being here with me today as we traveled through and journeyed through Harlem. As we journeyed through Harlem, I want to thank High Velocity Philosophy's channel on YouTube. Please like and subscribe his channel. Give him a thumbs up. And while you're here, I'm going to shoot this out to you so that you can also help me get to that 1,000 subs, okay? So, yes, yes, and yes, it's been wonderful being here with you. I pray that you have an incredible evening, afternoon, morning, wherever you are in the world watching this. Thank you so much for helping to build this channel. You can also travel across the street, the YouTube streets, to the Sheila Ingram Ministry Network. And that's where we give the word of God and we encourage people and build people up. It's right across the street. We're building that channel as well. Thank you so much. Stay tuned for more Bravo with Sheila. Uh, we're having a great time. That's all I can tell you. Thursday evenings, it's Dawn B. And then Mondays, we have another show. Wednesday, we have a show. We have so much going on here in these YouTube streets. And I want you to know that I am so grateful that you come to the channel and you hang out with us. Remember that Mondays is Beyond the Mic, and Tuesday I'm usually doing something. Wednesday, sometimes we do a special broadcast. Thursday, always with Dawn B. And also on Fridays on the other channel, the Sheila Ingram Ministry channel, you can stop by on 11 o'clock in the morning on Fridays, every Friday for the Women of Grace, and Tuesday mornings at 10 a.m. for Pastor Rosa, who gives a great, great word. And so we're just moving in these streets and trying to do what we do. So I pray that you're doing what you need to be doing. Remember that I love you, and I'll see you again soon. And stay tuned for more of Bravo with Sheila. All right. This has been wonderful. So wonderful. Wonderful, wonderful, wonderful. And we are out, out, out. Let's see how I can kind of push on out of here so it doesn't look like I'm just snapping off without talking to you. Let's push on out. Remember to like and subscribe. Hit that thumbs up button. Smash it. Just go ahead and smash it. I'll see you again soon.